So thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon for our Policy and Popcorn focused on policy briefs and effective communication and how to leverage social media and traditional media to have the greatest impact that you can possibly have. My name is Hannah Safford, and I'm a researcher with the Policy Institute. I coordinate the Policy and Popcorn series, and in addition, I do a lot of work for the Policy Institute that relates on the first part of the topics that we'll be talking about today. I do a lot of the focus on editing and communications and trying to get ideas front and center and just generally effective communication. So I'll be co-leading with Austin that first part of the session, which will focus on that aspect. And then we've hosted a workshop similar to this for Policy and Popcorn before, as well as in a couple of other fora for UC Davis. But we're very excited to bring you an enhanced version today that includes our colleagues from the UC Davis Office of Strategic Communications. And I will let them introduce themselves because I figure you know yourself better than anybody else does. I'll turn it over to my co-panelists in just a second to give their own introductions. Before I do that though, I wanna do a couple of logistical notes. If you haven't used Zoom webinar before, welcome to a new form of Zoom. Essentially, the only difference here is that you as an attendee can't participate in video by yourself. You also can't speak unless we unmute you. For the sake of making things easy, we, for the most part, won't be unmuting people to ask questions or comments. Instead, we ask that questions you funnel into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be answering questions as they come up. In addition, any outstanding questions, we'll reserve time at the end to address those. If you have things that aren't questions, if you're having technical difficulties, have a comment to add, have a pertinent link that you'd like to share, one of the great things about this virtual format is that it enables us to be collaborative and sharing stuff in real time. And so we ask you to use the chat box for that. If you're having technical difficulties in particular, you can direct those to Natalie and Sarah, who are also on the Zoom, and they can perhaps help you resolve those. And I think that's all of our technical notes. So maybe with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-panelists to give short introductions, and then we'll dive right into the content. So Austin, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Austin Brown. I direct the UC Davis Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy. We are a sort of an academic think tank at Davis, closely affiliated with the Institute of Transportation Studies and the Energy and Efficiency Institute. And our role is to try to help connect research and policy process. Before this, I was in DC for about a decade. And so I've worked closely with policymakers and heard all their frustrations with researchers, closely with researchers and heard all their frustrations with policymakers. And so out of that, and then collaboration with Hannah and others, we've tried to emerge the list of interesting tips and tricks to help bridge that gap a little bit more effectively that we'll share today. But maybe I'll pause there and give our other panelists a chance to introduce themselves. Maybe I'll pass it to Melissa if we're going to do so you know who's next.
All right, thank you. I'm Melissa Blouin. I'm the Director of News and Media Relations for UC Davis, and this week is my second anniversary at Davis. I have been working in media relations and science communications for a little more than 20 years. My background's actually in biochemistry originally. So in addition to understanding the frustrations between researchers and policymakers, I know a lot about the frustration between researchers and journalists. And that's one of the things that we'll be talking a little bit about today. And I look forward to a good discussion. Thank you.
Great, and I'll go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Sally Poggi. I'm the Director of Social Media here at UC Davis. I work hand in hand with Melissa. She's on my speed dial. We are fortunate to have each other, and what we do is I manage the team that does all of the content for the UC Davis main social media channels, amongst others. And then the other half of our job is really empowering our community here on campus of researchers, faculty, student, anybody who's interested in leveraging social media as a communications tool to do their best job possible. So these trainings are my absolute favorite to do, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about two things that I love, and that is influencing using social media. So excited to get into it.
Okay, and with that, I think we can go ahead and start. And Austin, you're gonna kick us off, right?
Sure thing. So I've got a few slides that we've collected on some of our thoughts. Are you able to see my slides okay? Oops, a little too early. Let me back up to the beginning. Great. So before I jump in, I'll say that, like everybody, we're adapting for the current times we're in. So Policy and Popcorn is usually a sort of small in-person gathering that we held on the UC Davis campus. The downside of moving to an online format is it makes it a little bit more challenging to engage in a conversation. What we really liked about Policy and Popcorn in person was it was a chance for the research community to really get there and have a fluid conversation with whoever was presenting and really get into these topics. That's a little bit more challenging in this format. The upside is we're actually able to reach a broader group of people, geographically speaking, especially. I've heard from several people who say, like, why weren't you doing this online before? So there's a trade-off, right? So what we can do, though, is I hope that you'll really feel comfortable dropping comments and questions into the Q&A box. Hannah and others will be keeping an eye on that, and we can, break up this presentation to talk about it, to answer questions. And then we've also tried our best to leave some good time at the end for discussion. So, whenever you have a question, don't need to hold it, just drop it into that Q&A box and we'll get to it as best we can. Okay, so these are some slides that Hannah and I have developed for a variety of venues, talking about this big question of how do you communicate science to policymakers. Please view this just as our perspective on some tips and tricks to do. It's something we've developed by observation over a long time. It's hard to have a sort of scientific method for how to do your best job communicating, but this is our perspective from many years of working on this topic. The good news is when it comes to scientists working with policymakers, we often see the differences between those communities, but in general, we have quite a lot in common. And the biggest thing that Hannah and I believe that policy and the science community have in common is they're both about problem solving. So the research that we do is attempting to identify and solve societal problems. Policymakers go to work every day for the most part because they want to apply their tools to help solve those same problems. Of course, within that, there's big challenges. So I think we can probably all seen examples of where there's a gap between research and policy. I found a paper a little while ago from 2017 by Marsden and Reardon that found they reviewed 100 papers in the journal Transportation Policy, which these are papers that really should and attempt to have policy applications front of mind. And they found that only 13% of transportation policy papers considered specific aspects of the policy cycle. So that means looked at, here's a real world way that this could be implemented. And 2/3 of the paper did not engage with any real world policy examples or policymakers. So if 2/3 of the papers in a policy focused journal are not really taking the real world issues around policymaking into account, I think we have a gap to fill, and we can think very hard about how to do it. So in terms of thinking about how to bridge that gap, one mistake I think researchers tend to make just at the outset is just thinking about a policymaker in the generic sense. So when you say, oh, who's going to use this research? A common response is, oh, well, policymakers. Now, who is actually a policymaker? Is that a legislator? That's often what we mean. Sure, a legislator is a policymaker, but it's also a regulator, a city planner, a philanthropic foundation in some cases is a policymaker. The CEO of a company is very important in terms of setting policy, research and development project managers. And really the answer, of course, is all of the above and many, many more specific individuals. So one very important piece of advice at the very beginning is when somebody asks you or you ask yourself, who is this work for? You find yourself about to say, oh, for policymakers. And I still, to this day, find myself with that first reaction. We need to go one level deeper and think, okay, That's great, but who and what specific organization might actually need to know this information? And if once you drill down and actually figure out who is the specific individual who you would most want to have this information, that then really helps you refine the rest of everything we're going to be talking about, because you can then take their perspective and their point of view when you're thinking about how to translate and adapt your work. You might present very different findings from the same research, but you might provide a very different angle on it if you're talking to a CEO of a business versus a regulator, for example. And of course, yeah, lots more. So I always think of step one for getting beyond your research's immediate impact and having an impact on policy is to consider the specific policymaker that you want to reach. Get beyond that generic concept of a policymaker. Then beyond that, we need to also, I mentioned, sort of getting into their point of view. So you always want to think about the point of view of the person that you're talking to rather than the point of view that you bring to it. So this is a generalization, but I'm going to explore a few different ways that the natural perspective that many scientists take differs from the natural perspective that many policymakers of these various types take. We often differ in terms of the time frame that we see these issues. So scientists do research that evolves over months and years, whereas policymakers, while the policy takes a long time, they often are looking for answers within hours or at weeks at the longest. So there's often a temporal mismatch where they say, okay, we just need to know, and scientist says, well, give me 2 years and I'll figure out the answer. They often differ in terms of the language that they apply. So policymakers might speak in terms of, wonky topics, and scientists in terms of specific jargon. We each have our own can'ts, right? The different terms that identify us as a member of a group that we've developed with each other over a long period of time working on the same topics. But since we've developed those different languages, there's often a big step involved in translation to think, am I using a term that will not mean something or would mean something different to a policymaker when they're talking about the same overall topic? We're very often very different in terms of how we consider and are comfortable with or uncomfortable with uncertainty. So you'll often find that policymakers, and this sort of goes part and parcel with their job and how they're asked to conduct themselves, tend to be uncomfortable with uncertainty and are looking for research to help reduce uncertainty and for them to be able to say, no, this is if we do this policy, this will be the outcome, or this is the correct approach to take. Scientists, we tend to love it. Scientists will often be very happy when they ask one question and it turns out that one question gives you 10 more questions to try to address. That's fine, but it also can, we always have to remember that at the end of the day, looking back and thinking about where can I add some certainty? What do we actually know that we can start with? What can we say with fairly high certainty and present it in a way that doesn't underrepresent the uncertainty, but just expresses the things first that we're the clearest about, right? So it's coming in and saying, here's what we think we know and why. There's plenty of things we don't know, but we can start with those. We often think differently about the scope. Policymakers tend to have many different topics on their plate, many different things they're working on, whereas scientists, as we get further and further into a field of study, tend to narrow down. So because we want to make scientific advancements, you're focusing in on one specific thing where you've had to learn all of this fundamental material before you're able then to add additional insights to the field. And then we use different decision factors in how we make decisions. So policymakers tend to be thinking about impacts on society, the economy, individuals or groups, whereas scientists may tend to make their decisions based, at least we try to make our decisions based entirely on evidence. And then in general, policymakers and scientists respond to different incentives. So policymakers are thinking about votes, or if they're not politicians, thinking about decisions and what they actually need to do and what that means for their position. Scientists tend to think in terms of increasing knowledge and developing publications to advance their science and their careers. And then in terms of complexity, both of these groups develop a sense of deep complexity around each of these topics. But we often will forget, right? So it's very easy to forget what it was like to not understand something when you are working on a topic with somebody who hasn't seen it before. And so being comfortable with taking a step back from that complexity and remembering that not everybody is as deep as you are in that topic it's valuable for communication for anybody, but especially with policymakers who might be familiar with and literate in the topic, but not down to that level of depth and complexity that you might be comfortable with. Hannah, I think, am I passing it over to back to you here, or a little later? We were going to hand off, but I don't remember exactly where.
Yes,
Sorry,
I'm on mute. Yeah, you're gonna keep going a little bit more.
All right.
You're gonna keep going through this slide and then through our first bullet.
Okay, cool. It's a lot easier, it turns out, in person to look over and be like, am I still going? Are you still going? When are we handing off? Pass the baton. Okay, thanks. So those strategies for thinking about different policymakers translate almost directly into what you can think about as strategies for writing and having success with that communication. So I already mentioned the importance of having an audience in mind, right? And we want to do this at the beginning of the writing process wherever possible. It doesn't have to be only for one individual, but you want to think, who would be the person I would literally want most in the world to read and understand this? If you're not writing something that works for that person, then you've probably lowered your chances of success right at the outset. Number two is, you really want, if you're taking this seriously, you're going to need to repackage your material. And Hannah will talk about what we mean by that in more detail later. But the raw material of your research is probably not going to be the item that you want to share with somebody who's looking to make policy decisions based on it. You need to be timely. We'll go much more into detail on each of these things, but if you are trying to influence a specific policy, there are natural timeframes where you will be able to be impactful, and you have to be ready for that. It doesn't do anyone any good if you produce the perfect policy brief 2 weeks after the legislative session ends, where they already voted on the bill that depended on your research, or where the regulatory hearing has already happened and they're no longer able to take public comment. So you have to be willing to go and look and see, what are these key timeframes that I need to be addressing, and how can I try to make sure that I'm hitting those deadlines. Clarity and concision are absolutely critical. It's very easy to start with a lot of complexity, and what we need to do is find friends who will, friends and colleagues who will edit our stuff down. Everybody starts writing where things are too complicated and contorted, and having a work with an editing process to bring that down into something that's as short as possible but no shorter is an essential element of the process. And then you need to be specific and actionable. And we'll come back to this at the very end with some examples. But what I mean here is, it's very easy to say, policymakers should increase research funding, or policymakers should do this broad, big thing. It also is very easy and common to recommend actions to a policymaker that they can't actually take. So for example, I talked about the difference between different specific policymakers. Legislators, legislative staff, regulators, regulatory staff can do very different things. When I was at Department of Energy, I got very first amused, then frustrated, and then sort of amused again at the number of people that would come in with a great idea. They would spend half an hour convincing us it was a great idea, and then ask us to do something that the Department of Energy legally can't do, right? Oh, you guys really need to regulate the efficiency of vehicles. We say, well, we legally can't do that, right? So you have to go and do the homework to figure out, what can the policymaker you're talking to actually do, and then try to get down as specific as possible to be able to communicate what action makes sense based on your research. So I mentioned this, we'll go back through this really quickly, but I mentioned have this audience in mind. So you want to really think through who is making the key decisions. And in some cases, that means writing multiple briefs or multiple communications materials, because each of these individuals might make a decision based on your research, but they're probably looking for a different angle or a different element of your research findings from each other. It's unlikely that one single communications approach could possibly work for all of the different individuals that might act based on your research. Okay. So now, Hannah, I think I'm passing it back to you. So let me know when you want to advance the slide, and I can.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to talk about a few of the other strategies in more depth that Austin quickly summarized. So talking about repackaging your material. So Austin and I are both scientists. We've both done bench science. And so we know that if you're a scientist and you pretty much stop at the second tier, you laboriously collect all of your data. And then after a ton of work, you finally, if everything goes well, get it into a journal article. And then you're pretty exhausted and you've got a whole lot of other things that you've got to do, and you want to stop there. And I would encourage you, I think we would both encourage you to take a little break, but don't necessarily stop there, because if you're truly looking to maximize your impact, you're not going to, you can put 90% of the time into doing the stuff, and you'll get about 1/10 of the impact that you would if you put another 10% of your time into repackaging your material so that multiple audiences can access it. What I think about two different analogies for this kind of thing. One is like when you're applying to a whole bunch of jobs, you can send the same resume out to a whole bunch of jobs, but as anybody who's ever gone through a job search knows, that's going to be a lot less effective than tailoring your resume to each job that you really, really want. So if there's a particular audience that you really, really want, you don't have to rewrite everything from scratch, but you do have to take the things that are most important to that particular audience and draw them out into a format that that audience is familiar with, is more likely to encounter, and is going to have an easier time digesting. I also think Austin and I both like to cook quite a bit, and I think about, you've gone through all the effort to do your mise en place. That's the boring, tedious part. And then you really get to get cooking, where you get to take all the fun stuff that you've designed and put it out into the world and make stuff happen. And you've actually got like a product that you want to engage with at the end of the day. And it's not just all the ingredients sitting there. We think about repackaging material as somewhat of a pyramid, though I don't want to imply that these things all have to happen sequentially. It's simply a pyramid stacked in kind of order of length and focus. So again, if you're doing science, you'll start with your data, you'll craft that into a primary journal article or something similar. Then perhaps you might occasionally do a roundup and do still a scientific article, but now it's more of a review article that focuses on the analysis and trends, or somebody else does it for you and you just get swept up in that. And then it's really these top couple of tiers that is the bread and butter of policy communication, of science policy communication. These are products that we at the Policy Institute work with quite a bit, and we can tell you that it's those three products, a policy brief, a blog or an op-ed, or something even shorter than that, that's really going to ensure that you're communicating with the audiences that you want to reach far more than a scientific article ever will. So starting at the top of those and working our way down, one of the best messages that we've ever gotten is to think about, when you're trying to think about how you craft your message, think about what you would do if you had to put it on a bumper sticker. If you literally had to communicate the most important insight on something as small as a bumper sticker, start there and expand out rather than starting out and trying to condense in, because it's hard to kill your darlings, but it's easy to start with one darling and then add other ones in as you have space. In the virtual world, that can translate also to something like a tweet or a social media post, which Austin, you can advance one, which is going to be discussed more deeply in part 2 of this session. Going down one tier and thinking about the blog and op-ed space, I think Melissa is going to talk a bit more about op-eds and where they can and cannot be effective. Blogs are similar in a way to op-eds, that they allow you to express an opinion, and you can often be your own gatekeeper with those. If you have your own blog, then you can of course publish whatever you want, and other outlets tend to be more flexible with what they allow guest posted on their blog than an op-ed page is, but that's still a way for you to take something that you've done and put an opinion on it. And then the policy brief is something that we get a lot of questions about, and that tends to generate a lot of confusion. You can go to the next slide. And that's because, while everybody at this point is familiar with tweets, with social media posts, with what a blog post or an op-ed looks like, the policy brief isn't something that we typically encounter in our day-to-day. We think about, while peer-reviewed journal articles are the currency of the scientific realm, a policy brief is more of the currency of the policy realm. And there's no one set definition of what a policy brief is, in the same way as there's no one set definition of what a blog post is. Generally speaking, a policy brief is something that takes key insights for policymakers from either a specific scientific study or a collection of scientific studies, provides some brief background, and then really focuses on what the recommendations and the implications are for the policymakers that you're trying to reach. You can advance, Austin, through the 3 bullets. Again, so there's no real definition. And actually go back one. And you don't want to try and force anything that you're doing into one specific format. At the Policy Institute, we have our own template, but we'll adjust the template based on what's the most effective way to communicate the messages that we want to communicate. And if that means making it a little bit longer so you can get some key figures in, that's fine. If that means making it shorter because you don't want to overwhelm your target audience with a lot of extra information, that's fine as well. But generally, we're looking for an easily accessible synthesis of key insights and recommendations related to a specific policy topic. I'll show a couple of examples of ones that we've worked on. Next slide. So this is one that I actually developed when I was doing graduate work at Princeton. It was about community solar for the state of New Jersey. This was just a 1-page policy brief. We wanted to try and keep it really brief as a policy brief because we were targeting state legislators who we knew didn't have a lot of time to read stuff. And there was an accompanying report. And so we didn't have to go into a lot of detail because the idea of this policy brief was simply to pique policymakers' interest. And so you can see from this that you have recommendations are taking up almost the majority of this 1-page document. You still have room for a couple of graphics. You devote very little time to background. I think we only have about a sentence or 2 defining what community solar is. And then it's also tailored to the audience. It's not about community solar generally speaking, it's about community solar in New Jersey because this policy brief was designed to provide recommendations to that specific audience. If we were going to extend it to a different state, we would provide the context for that state. Next slide. And then this is the most recent policy brief that we published through the Policy Institute. This one was a little longer. I think we only just have the front page of it on, but it's still a 2-page document. It's just front and back. So it's a sheet of paper that you can easily distribute to a target audience. I actually think we have Ingrid, who was the most of the brain power behind this policy brief, is actually on the call today. So hi, Ingrid, you did a great job. We're happy to highlight this policy brief today. And this topic was a little bit denser. It's a little bit targeted more at regulators, not necessarily legislators. So people who are going to be a little bit more familiar with the topic, who are okay with reading something a bit denser. But we've still broken it up so that it's easy to skim. It's easy to find the information that you want to find. It's got a graphic in there that shows some of the key information. It's got headings. So it's really something that's digestible to a policymaker. Next slide. Yeah, and so again, form should follow function, but in general, a good policy brief is going to be short. We like to go for 2 pages or 1 page front and back because it's easy to distribute in person. It's, I suppose, a bit less relevant now that we don't do in person anymore, but it's a good rule of thumb. But you can extend it if you need to. You want to provide some specifics, especially what are going to be those really actionable recommendations, but you don't have to do a whole lot of detail on the recommendations because if you really interest somebody, they'll reach out to you. Next bullet. And again, you want the policy brief to be visually appealing because it doesn't matter how good your stuff is if nobody wants to read it in the first place, if it's too dense and daunting. Our third strategy is being timely. Next slide. And I want to think about this in 2 ways. When you're thinking about your best opportunity that you have to engage with the policy process and influence policy processes, first thing that you should be thinking about is how can you think ahead? You want to try not be reactive to events that have just happened, but you want to be proactive and think about what you expect to be coming down the pipeline. Sometimes that means that you repackage your material and you wait for the right moment to send something out. It also can mean trying to stay ahead of trends and trying to know, okay, what's a bill that just recently got introduced into the state legislature, and can I produce a policy brief so that I've got that in my back pocket as that gets voted on later in the legislative calendar. We are inspired in this by Wayne Gretzky's quote about that he skates to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. So trying to be forward thinking and preparing for what's going to come next. Next slide. And each of these ones is about picking your moment. So while you do generally want to always be thinking about visioning what's going to be the next thing, what's coming down the pipe, certainly there are specific moments that are better than others to seize your moment. We think about policy windows, policy cycles, and then hooks for anything that you're trying to introduce. A policy window is when something happens in the news that gives you an opportunity. It can either be an unexpected development. Something like COVID has certainly opened up windows for a whole bunch of policies that would have been difficult to get through in other times. It also closes some windows when people are really focused on COVID. They're not going to be so interested in other types of proposals. So thinking about when windows are opening and closing, it's also known as the Overton window, is the sort of the technical theoretical name for it. Being aware of policy cycles is important, and really obvious one is cycles of elected officials. Right after an official gets into office is a pretty good time for you to hit them with a lot of new ideas because there's a lot of energy. They've got the whole term stretching out ahead of them. If they're a newly elected official, perhaps they're not as jaded as they might otherwise be, but hitting somebody up towards the end of their term, not a great time to engage them with a whole bunch of new ideas because they're going to be pretty focused on getting themselves elected. Similarly, thinking about the legislative calendar, you have to think about early in the year is a good time to suggest ideas for legislation because that's when bills are being drafted. By the time it's August and September, all the bills have been set and it's just a matter of voting on them and doing an up-down on the things that are already out there. And then finally, policy hooks. You might have a great idea. Maybe you've done a scientific study that's just come out on trees and you don't really expect that people are going to be particularly jazzed about trees for any reason in the near future. You don't see a specific policy window. You don't see a reason why that study would be linked to a legislative cycle, to other policy cycle. But you've come up with this study in March, maybe you hold off on really trying to publicize it until it's Arbor Day. And then you have this hook and newspapers and other media outlets are looking for content and you can try and slot yourself into that and try and make it timely and relevant. Next slide. And then the final strategy that I'll talk about is simply being clear and concise in everything that you do. Next slide. This is where you can be helped by just looking at general writing resources. Generally speaking, in any kind of document that you're writing, whether it's at the bottom of our repackaging pyramid or at the top, the shorter the paragraph, sentences, and words you can use, the more digestible your material is going to be. That doesn't mean that you're dumbing it down. It just means that you're making it easy to access. Next. You always want to be using straightforward and consistent language. Don't worry about dressing it up. Try and take away the jargon. Just explain what you're trying to talk about and don't go any further. When I talk about consistent language, I also mean consistent terminology. So people will have a tendency to use two different terms to refer to the same concept. Those two terms might be interchangeable, in which case it's fine to use both of them, but you want to be very clear that they are interchangeable. Or if they're interchangeable, you need to be sure that, and you don't use both of them, just stick to one, but it's confusing when you use one term 80% of the time and then switch over to another. Organize your writing. We saw this with the policy briefs, that headings, bullet points can be very helpful for orienting a reader and enabling them to navigate a product that you've produced. Next. Make your audience care. Show them why you're passionate about something in particular. This also relates to policy hooks. Why should an audience care about something in particular at the time you're presenting it to them? Next. And then in everything that you're doing, just try and have good writing mechanics. People often dismiss it. This again goes back to you spend 90% of your time collecting the data. Take the 10% of your time to just make sure it looks good. Because if you're sloppy, if you leave out periods, if you have inconsistent spacing, if you have inconsistent formatting, it makes it look bad. And the worse it looks, the less people trust you. And this is something, not everybody is a talented writer right off the bat, but everybody can be a good editor when it comes to mechanics. That's just a matter of going back through your work and trying to make sure that all of the stuff that you can control fundamentally is there. Next. One couple of resources that I'll recommend on just writing effectively and writing mechanics. One is this Writing That Works, is developed for business writing, but I think a lot of the principles therein are applicable to policy documents as well. Next. And an online tool is the Hemingway app. This can help you if you're somebody who tends to be a little long-winded in your writing. You can copy and paste whatever text you have into the Hemingway app. It's not perfect, but it'll highlight where you have sentences that are really long, where you have words that are especially complex, and it can't fix it for you, but it can draw your eye to where there's problems. Next. And then the last set of resources that I'd point you to is just other places where people are, where their job is to communicate complex ideas in a compelling and engaging way. TED Talks, podcasts, traditional media outlets, less traditional media outlets. If you have a scientific concept and you think this is so complex, I can't possibly communicate it in a straightforward way, and I encourage you to find a podcast, find a TED Talk, find an article on it, and get some inspiration from there, because I guarantee there's something out there, and I guarantee it'll give you a place to start. Next. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Austin, just to close us out.
Great, I'll just wrap us up with an example about the concept of being specific and actionable. So I mentioned this at the beginning, but as a reminder, so specific, you can think about this like a good way to do it is read any of your recommendations and say, are these specific enough that whoever is reading it would know how to say yes? So if they said, yes, I'm convinced I'm going to do this thing, would they know what to do next? It might sound a little ridiculous, but if you go and read your own writing with that lens, you'll often say, actually, I was too general. I need to make this more specific. Almost always with policy briefs, the hard part, but the important part is getting the recommendation to be more specific than they otherwise would have been. It's easy to say, policy should do this big thing. Okay, let's get actually down to something that you could say yes to and implement. And then actionable, this is taking into account, again, thinking back to your model policymaker, the literal person or organization you would want to read and act on it. Do they have the authority? Are they able to act on that? So there's a couple examples. So we could say some non-specific things like, California should encourage more people to drive electric vehicles. There are plenty of recommendations out there of this nature. It sounds great. Somebody could say, yeah, I want to do that, but California doesn't tend to make decisions as a unit. And then, okay, so what would California actually do? And so you could, get more specific by saying California should make it easier for lower income people to drive EVs by installing level chargers in multi-unit dwellings. Maybe that's, if that's what comes out of your research, right? So I'm not recommending any of these as actual recommendations. The idea is just to think, what does encourage mean? What does people mean? How do we actually take these down to be less specific to more specific? You could even get, depending on whether you're able to, more specific than this and go down to what agency should start doing this, or what incentives the legislature should consider, what specific committee should consider in a bill. You can go layers deeper and deeper into something that could actually be acted upon. Then there's things that are non-actionable. I mentioned examples at Department of Energy. We got lots of stuff like, the federal government should require universities to do things. So an example here is should require all universities to offer diversity training to students and employees. Generally speaking, the federal government can't require universities to do a specific thing. It's often out of their jurisdiction. And so you might think of something that would be more actionable. In this case, you could say the federal government should withhold federal funding, something that the government in many cases is able to do. And again, here I'm not a lawyer. I'm not making this recommendation. This this isn't even my policy area of focus, just reading something that, okay, there's actually no way that could be acted on. Let's think about changing a recommendation to something that could actually be actionable by that organization. So that's what we've got on the subject of communicating with policymakers. Hannah, do you want to hand it off to Melissa and Sally for theirs?
Yes, I think Melissa and Sally, you guys should just be able to take over the screen sharing, and I don't see any questions specifically for us in the Q&A right now. Again, we encourage attendees to throw those in there as you have them. But yeah, let's switch to part 2.
All right, I'm going to turn on my screen share. So let's make sure this works and then we will get started here. Maybe while I'm doing that, maybe everybody stretch a little bit. I'm sure everybody's been Zooming quite a bit today. Let's see. How are we looking here?
Looking good.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Let's go ahead and go into present mode. Okay. All right.
There we go.
Here we are. We're ready.
All right. You want me to start? I think our first slide is us introducing ourselves.
Oh, that's true. Let's get that out of the way. I think we kind of did that already.
We kind of did that already. So I will say too that, wherever you are working and wherever you end up, one thing you should always consider is contacting your communications office. So if you are considering writing a blog or writing an op-ed, or if you want to get something into the media, they are a resource, and we do have some resources that we've provided at the end of this presentation for you. So, hello.
Real quickly, are there gray boxes over the presentation?
No, it looks good.
No, you're good. No gray boxes. That's just an Austin problem.
You'd think I've presented on 100 Zoom calls, and that's a new one. So Zoom knows how to always throw you a little bit of a curveball. Technology's
great. All right. Okay, ready, Melissa? I'm gonna start advancing the slides.
All right, ready.
Here we go. Oops. Okay.
So we're going to start out by talking a little bit about understanding the media landscape. And I really felt that Austin and Hannah had a great introduction, because a lot of things I'm saying will just take what they were talking about and take it a little further into this landscape that that is probably a little bit less familiar to you and how that works. So we'll start first by talking about earned media and some of the audience and channels that are there, some of the messaging that you might do, and then we will end that part with op-eds and how you might go about starting to do op-eds. And then I will turn it over to Sally for social. So we had a few questions for you all to begin with. We wanted to know a little bit about who has media experience, either media or social media. What has your experience, was your experience positive or negative? And who is using social media? So feel free to drop your answers in the chat or in the Q&A. That will help us just have an idea of how much experience, if any, anyone has had. So if no one has had media experience, all right, here we go. We've got a couple people talking about LinkedIn for sharing papers, media experience, Twitter. A bunch of science nerds are using social media in my sector. Yes, on media experience, generally positive. Okay, that's good. Using Twitter to promote reports, haven't seen much engagement there. Have had more success in promoting through email. So that's really helpful to think about. So we will talk a little bit about some of that as we're going along. And if anybody wants to drop things in the chat as we're going along, please do.
And we'll say too, like, don't be shy about participating. This is about helping you all, and also your answers are going to help each other. So don't be shy about dropping in some commentary. We love to see it. And also it makes sure that y'all are out there paying attention.
All right, yes, absolutely. Okay. So we're going to talk first about earned media. And, you know, when we talk about earned media, it is really talking about anything where you're going to somebody and they're going to be talking, they're going to be doing the writing. And one of the first things we wanted to talk about a little bit was looking at the way that academics message things and the way that journalists talk about things. So journalists want to look at the impact and results immediately. One of my favorite anecdotes about this is the first story that I ever wrote about, where a scientist came to me and said, we have this really important thing. And I read through 4 pages, and at the end of it, they said, you know that Mars rock that NASA thought proved that had life on Mars? Well, we've shown it didn't. And that was on page 4 at the very end. And I was like, okay, well, we're going to turn this around and we're going to say that first. And that news story actually went internationally, and they were in journals all over, you know, in newspapers and places all over the world. And they were very shocked, I think, by that. But so you want to think about this when if you're looking at writing something for the media, and it's even more immediate than, you know, say in your policy paper, where you might want to introduce a concept or a problem. Journalists really want to get to the meat of what is it that's important to my audience. Then they want to go to the details, and then they're going to have the background. So when you're thinking about presenting to a journalistic audience, you want to think kind of in exactly the opposite way of the way most research papers are written. And in fact, when I am writing a science communication piece, I almost always go directly to the results if I'm looking at your papers. Or if you've conveniently provided a summary for me at the top that tells me the results, then I'll go there first. But that's what we're looking for when we're writing. All right, next slide. Oh, my media landscape isn't in here. Okay, so defining your audience. They've talked a little bit about this in the last one, and so want to go here again. In journalism, it's usually, you know, well, we want to tell the public about this, but you need to be a lot more specific than that, because there are a lot of different demographics. Are we talking about people who have influence here? Are we talking about legislators? Are we talking about CEOs? Or are we talking about business people? Or are we talking about students? So what is the major audience that you're wanting to reach? And where are they? Somebody mentioned a minute ago that they were trying to use Twitter to get attention for something, but they had more success with email. So that indicates that their audience that they were looking for at that point was more likely to be looking for things by email. So when you think about audiences, you want to think about, you know, where are those people, and what are they basically, you know, what are they looking at? Are they in social media? Are they reading things through social media? So a lot of people for instance, they read the Washington Post, but they're reading it through social media. What do they need to know? And I think this goes back to something that Austin and Hannah were saying, which is it goes back to, you know, the policy people are thinking about a certain thing, but then if you're looking to go directly to your audiences with information, they may not be looking for the same thing that the policy people were looking for, or that you thought was the most important thing about your piece. So you need to think, what is the thing that's going to motivate my audience to be interested in this? So you would never go to, you wouldn't go to a family gathering and just start out by saying, here's this general, you know, here's a policy paper. You would go to, you know, your aunt, and you would say, hey, this is the part of this that you would be really interested, I think you would find really interesting. So you want to find that, whatever it is that you think that people will find really interesting, and you have to think about your audience and what is it that you want to know. So then how are you going to reach them? And that's the next thing we'll talk about. So the media landscape. When people, when we think about traditional media, of course, people think about newspapers, magazines, those kinds of things. But when you look at the media landscape today, and as I said, we tend to call it earned media. So that's anything where you're reaching out to a reporter or a blogger or somebody who has a podcast. If you look at NPR, there are a lot of podcasts on NPR. If you go to the New York Times, you have Carl Zimmer, who is a science writer. If you go to, say, Discover Magazine, they actually have a reporter who I've known for many years who specifically focuses on mathematics. So you can look around and at the media landscape and find different kinds of reporters who are looking at things. And when we're looking at where we're going to send some of the stories that we do through our office, I would say there are probably 15 or so different kinds of ways to reach people. And we do actually sometimes use social media to go directly to people as well. And one of those is op-eds, which we will get into here a little bit later. All right. So, and here we are at op-eds. With op-eds, you can, and somebody asked the questions about resources open to faculty and not grad students. It does, it is, we actually do a fair amount of training. We do mostly have a specific training for faculty, but we do have science communicators who work on your beats. And in fact, Kat Kerlin, some of you may have worked with her or heard of her. So there are different ways to that we can assist with things. And if you are being invited to do something like a podcast and you want some help with prep, then do come to us and we could talk about that. Some of the resources that we have on our website that we'll mention at the end are publicly available, so you can go to those and download them. But if you have specific questions, you also can come to us, and that comes with the training and practice. With op-eds, you can, a lot of times editors will want to work with you. And one thing to keep in mind too is, I guess another question I would ask you is, somebody was talking earlier about, tailoring your pieces. How long does anybody have a guess as to how long most op-ed pieces are or should be? Anyone in the chat? Throw out some numbers. Don't be shy. 300 is a good guess. Anyone else? 400 to 600, 2 pages. So it's generally about, oops, what's that mean? Sorry. So it's generally about 600 to 750 words. And so this, a lot of times I've had faculty come to me where they've written something and it's about, it's 2,000 words. And then we have to take it and bring it way in and bring it way down. So when you have that few words, especially on a policy brief, you can have a little bit more. Maybe you can have 2 pages. So you're having to distill that information down even further. So just be keeping that in mind and thinking about that. And that goes back to looking at that pyramid and thinking about, what is the most essential information that I need to get across in this particular thing? So editors generally will work with you, and we're going to talk a little bit more about pitching here in a second and what you can do there in order to get your, pitch an op-ed to an editor. And again, we can work with you on that. And editors will expect, of the op-ed pages, will expect to be able to, work with you to edit your piece. We also, the UC system is part of a an online group called The Conversation, where people write perspective pieces that are timely in the news. And this is a great way actually to get started. The people who run The Conversation actually mostly used to work for the Boston Globe and other journalistic organizations. So they're very skilled in working with people, and they work directly with faculty members and graduate students on the pieces. So you get a lot of really good advice and a lot of good perspective on how to write a piece. And we can put you in touch with them if you think you have something that's timely, which leads to the next slide. So again, as I said, it's always a good idea to get in contact with media relations if you have something going on. Typically speaking, we are looking for things that have been published in peer-reviewed organizations or peer-reviewed journals. But particularly with things that have to do with policy, we are still interested in that and in seeing if there is a way that we can share the perspective on those things, on the research that's gone into those. Really important thing to think about, that we think about all the time, and that if you are looking to publish an op-ed is important, is to think about your audience and think about targeting reporters. So if you're interested in being in earned media of some kind, it's a good idea to be looking at that media and determining who's writing things about what it is that you're actually researching. And so that way, eventually you know how to pitch them. A reporter who just recently passed away, who worked at the San Francisco Chronicle until he was 96, once said, you know, the best PIO, public information officer I know, I only hear from once a year, but when he calls, I always know it's going to be a story I'm going to do. And that's the person that we aspire to be in our office. And that's probably the person that you want to be too, that when you go to somebody and say, hey, I have an op-ed for you, that they're going to be like, that's it. So you want to do the research on that. There are guidelines at a lot of places for op-eds. So it's worth finding those guidelines, and a lot of times they will tell you how long the op-eds are, or what kinds of things they're looking for, and how to submit. But I would say, your first stop should be our resources and contacting us, and that would be true, at whatever institution you go to. Our offices are here to assist you. I've worked at 3 different public universities, and we do want to hear from you because we're interested in what's going on. And the website that I have right there has a broad range of resources. At the end, we're going to give you the communicationsguide.ucdavis.edu. We're going to give you more specific links at the end of this presentation. So next slide. Yeah, so timing is everything, as they were saying, for policy papers and also for the media. So just one example is that that recently the current administration had been threatening to stop immigration into the country with what was happening with COVID. And so Giovanni Perry had written a policy paper on the importance of immigration to the economy. So he was able to go out at that moment. I'm not even sure he had written it right then, but he was able to go out in that moment and say, here's what I have to say about what's happening right now. And many, many media outlets picked that up, and it was in the New York Times and some other places, and had a lot of influence. So part of what's important is just to be aware of what's happening in the media, which is very different. Obviously, the media timeline is really a matter of hours, not, sometimes minutes sometimes hour. So just being aware of what's out there and what's happening, and then being timely about that and being available. So that's a very important aspect of it too, is that if you do have something that's really timely, want to be available in that moment. Sometimes people will say, well, I have this important thing, but I'm going to be gone for a few days. And it's like, well, we probably should go back to it, because the media cycle today, because it's 24/7, it's just happening instantly, and things blow up really quickly, both there and in social media. Next slide. All right. Did you want to take it from here on this one?
Yeah, this is a great moment to jump in, actually, because
I mean, it's everything.
Timing and expertise is everything. And I think one of the things that questions I always get from faculty, from grad students, from anyone that's working in this space and trying to leverage social media is, what's the lightning in the bottle? Like, how do I just get in front of the media right in the first tweet I put out, or how do I get more people to see the work that I'm doing using social media? And I always kind of backtrack, and we always talk about how you have to establish your credibility. That's a long game, right? That's a marathon. That doesn't happen overnight. And then you have to be able to match your expertise for the right moment in time. And I love showing this example. It's actually pretty old. It's probably time to look for a new example. But this happened back in 2016, which also seems like a million years ago. But there was a police shooting in Dallas. It was a sniper in a parking garage, and there was an incident that happened, and the police sent in a drone to diffuse the situation, and eventually did terminate the person's life using a drone, which was pretty controversial. And we have a professor here, a law professor, and her area of expertise is really around policing, law, and also the use of technology. And she is very well established on Twitter. She stays in her lane. She talks about these things. She has established her credibility. And in that moment, that night, she did tweet this tweet just to say, like, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but have we just seen the first use of a lethal robot in American policing? And you can see these numbers are very outdated, but quickly over the next couple of hours got picked up, reshared, and the media quickly saw this on Twitter, and her inbox became flooded with media requests to lend her expertise to this moment in time. And by the next morning, she was in the New York Times on the front cover of the opinion pages. This is Professor Elizabeth Joe, about the need for regulation with the use of policing and automation. So this is a really interesting example, because if you were just to look at this on first blush, you'd be like, wow, she's so lucky, or wow, she just really struck gold. But she actually has done a lot of work to establish her credibility, so that when the moment was right, she was ready to provide her expertise into that situation. So we're going to unpack it a little bit and really start talking about how you can use social media to influence media, which can influence policymakers, or you can go directly to policymakers, and there's many ways to actually have influence. The first, I just want to take a quick gut check and make sure that everybody's on the same page. The advice in the next couple of slides is really more, but we're going to be focusing on the personal side, the personal use of social media versus the organizational use of social media. So we're not necessarily really going to touch on some of the nuances that are needed to be thought through for when you're doing it on behalf of an organization, a lab, your institute. We're really talking about the personal use, where you have much more freedoms to talk about the things that you want to talk about, your opinion, your lens on the world, versus doing it on behalf of an organization. You have just many different considerations. So we're really going to focus on this, the left side of the slide, if you will. No, I think we're not going to, there's no way we're going to have time in the next 20 minutes to talk about platform necessarily. So I just want to ground us in a little bit of social media values, because regardless of whether or what platform you may or may not use, whether it's Twitter or all the way to TikTok, they can come, they can go, but if you're grounded in good values, you will always be able to navigate the space. The first is that good social media is really about listening first before you ever go out and talk. And we're going to talk through some tips on how to be a really good social media listener, which will make you a much better social media writer. Second, it's all about the relationships. So I think a lot of people focus on the social media part of like, what am I going to say? What are my tweets going to be? What is my presence going to be? That is a good thing to think about, but it's actually the wrong focus. The focus first is, how am I going to listen? How am I going to be responsive to the community? And then how am I going to build relationships? Because all of that work is, anytime you do have something to say, that's the foundation of the work that it's going to be built upon. We're going to talk a little bit about being transparent. Being human is such an important part of doing good social media, telling your story. And it's not just, here's my opinion on a piece of policy, or here's my opinion on science. You need to be able to mix in a little bit of about who you are and your passions, because people connect with people. They don't connect with policy briefs. So that's going to be a big tool for leveraging influence. We're going to talk a little bit about establishing credibility. And then just a reminder that with social media, again, not required, but if this is an interest to you, this is a journey. This is something that takes a lot of time, and not necessarily as a quick fix or lightning in a bottle. So we just want to establish that going in. All right. So good social media starts with really good listening. And this is something you should be probably pretty comfortable with, but don't forget this step as you're starting to think about, you've made your policy brief, you've gotten through the research, you've done your research on the legislative cycle. Now you got to go and do some good old-fashioned Googling online to see, where are people talking about these topics? Who is talking about these topics? How are they talking about these topics? And even the words that they're using can give you a lot of good clues on how to frame your own research within this context. So first, good old-fashioned Google. Google News, Google Images, do some good sweeps. And then we also recommend everybody search natively within the social media platform that you're the most comfortable within. But also try to poke out and find other communities. So open up Instagram on your browser or on your phone and just try doing some searches to see what people are talking about. You might be surprised where some of the conversation is happening. A lot of people come to me and like, hey, I've tweeted about this, but I'm not getting any interaction. And one of my first commentary is that actually where people are talking about that topic? It might not be Twitter. It might be on Reddit. It might be on Medium. It might be on LinkedIn. Do you know where people are talking? And a lot of people haven't actually backed up and done that research. I see, Daniel, your question about searching natively. That just means, thank you for catching me in my own jargon. That means to open up Twitter, like twitter.com, and do the search within the Twitter application or the Twitter search browsing. So not relying on Google to do all of your ads, word search. You go into the actual application or the program or the site to do the searching. Okay. Allowing yourself to go down the rabbit holes is going to be so critical. So allow yourself to look at the hashtags and look at the tags and look at the words, and just give yourself the freedom and the creativity to do that. I'm going to go through really quickly some tips on how to use some online tools to keep yourself organized so that you don't always have to like look into the fire hose every time you turn on the internet. So the first is, make sure that you're Googling your own name. If you haven't done that recently, definitely get on that. Make sure you understand what's being said about you and where your name is popping up as well. And that this frame is my Google search results. I'm not very interesting, so but I'll show you a profile of somebody who is more interesting, Jonathan Eisen here on campus. And you'll see on the right side of the screen, he has what's called a knowledge graph. And that is picking up from his Wikipedia profile. And so if this is you, if you're searching online for you and you have a knowledge graph, please go and see the little button on the very, very bottom where it says claim this knowledge panel. You should do that for yourself. You get into Wikipedia after having a certain amount of citations. This is generally something to aim for, but when you're first starting out, it's going to take a while to get here, but you should at least be aware of what is being said around your name online. The second tip I have for everyone is to leverage the power of Google Alerts. So if you go to Alerts or just Google Alerts, it will take you to this site, and you can set up different word searches for topics that you're interested in. And then there's all sorts of functions about when it will email you, how frequently. You can see these are some of my Google alerts that I have. I want to know anytime UC Davis is mentioned along with mental health or One Health or climate. I also have my own name in here so that if I happen to be mentioned online, I will get an immediate ping so I know what that looks like. These are just ways to keep you plugged in without always having to be looking. The second one, and this is going back to the native searching, but if you are active on Twitter, Twitter actually has a lot of deep search ability. And if you go to twitter.com/search-advanced, you can do all sorts of really cool searches within Twitter, looking at hashtags, date ranges. If you go to a conference, you can like bracket the date ranges or a location, and you can find what tweets were happening around that. You can get really zeroed in. And this is really good for doing your research around who is talking about policy for whatever topic that you're working on. But again, this is just going to get you more tapped in, more tuned in, and more educated when you go out to actually speak about the work that you're doing. Last online listening tip is to, again, this is for Twitter, and that is if you have a couple of, as you're doing all your listening and there's like some key people you just really want to track, maybe it's a legislative member, maybe it's their staff members, any CEOs or anything that you want to do. If you want to see what they're talking about, you can leverage this following tool. So you have to follow them first. And then once you follow them, you'll be able to see that little bell, and that's an alert. And you can set an alert so that anytime they tweet, you get served a tweet so you never miss a beat. And again, use this with caution. But for example, I do this for Chancellor Gary May because anytime he tweets, I want to be able to see it. All right. So moving into establishing credibility, this seems like a no-brainer, but it's often overlooked. Just complete your bio. Whatever social media platform you're working on that you're comfortable in, complete your bio. Use a photo of your face. You don't have to make it, you could have sunglasses on, you could have a hat on, whatever you need to do to feel really confident and retain what privacy you feel comfortable with. But the key to this is that you look and act human. Okay, there's a lot of bots out there. So when people are looking for credibility, they're gonna come to your bio, and if you don't look official or like a real person, they're out. They're not gonna follow you. They're not gonna take what you're saying as credible. So you need to make sure that you have a profile and a header picture. You need to complete your bio. Consider in your bio, which is this little section right here where it says, this is Carla, my colleague, include your hashtags, your topics, your website if you have one, especially for researchers, include any credentials and awards that you might have. So if you're a PhD, put that in there. If you have any grants, like put that all in there to help with your credibility. And if you want to, we are constantly looking for folks who are connected to UC Davis who are doing work. And so if you tag UC Davis, we'll find you and we'll include you on lists. And then most importantly, just to create a little bit of space between yourself and the institution or your organization or wherever you're working with, is just to include the disclaimer, thoughts are my own. It's as simple as that. And that gives you a lot of freedom to say what you need to say, speak your truth without having to feel like you're necessarily avoid any confusion about speaking on behalf of the institute or the employer. So that gives you a little bit of like freedom and hopefully gives you a lot of comfort. When it comes to content, so you've done your listening, you feel good about that, you've got your bio, you're credible, you got your shop set up. Now what do you start talking about? There's a lot of pyramids in all of these presentations. I'm going to add one more in. When you start with your research, and I love to think about how you can take that and you start to think about how you can make it snackable, if you will. So each tweet should be just a single thought, a single concept that you can keep breaking it down into littler and littler pieces. You can string those pieces together. You can, so just think about ways that you can kind of piece it apart, all of your content, and then you can actually collect it back together. So the content can kind of like expand and contract. And for social media, I think the coolest thing about it is that you get to practice a lot. So you get to practice with different words, different concepts. You can be repetitive, and that helps you conceptualize. It helps you articulate what it is that you're trying to do, and you can keep practicing and see what people react to or not. So think about the suite of content that you have, starting with whatever research or the data that you have, and then how you can piece that apart. A couple notes on hashtagging and tagging. Nobody owns hashtags, but if you're going to use them, please research them and be aware of what you're using before you just throw them into your copy. I went, and there's actually a lot of really great science policy and science communication hashtags that are used on Instagram and Twitter in particular. SciPol is like amazing. There's such really good conversations going on about how to do this kind of work, but also other kinds of data. So just really great information. Don't over hashtag, so be very selective with the ones that you're using. And if you're going to use hashtags, it's called camel case, which means each word has the capital letter, and that is really important for accessibility. So if we have, some people with sight readers, it just makes it much more accessible. So be sure to, it's a small little thing that can make a really big difference. And then when it comes to tagging individuals, there is some etiquette here. You'll see some bad etiquette is if somebody has like a comment and then they tag, Doris Matsui and council member, and they tag everybody and UC Davis. And so that is, try not to do that. Try to, when you're tagging a person, especially if it's a key level person, just be aware of how you're using that, because if you're constantly putting that person on blast or tagging them, it actually gets more annoying for the people who are reading it. So be very selective about how you're going to tag. I'm going to do a little time check. We're running a little bit late, so I'm going to zoom through these a little bit fast. Real quick, put the social in social media. This is the magic sauce. So you might not get a million hits on your tweet, but if you're out there and you're reacting to other people, you're talking to people, you're commenting, you're liking, you're following back, that's all the magic of social media. So the more that you do that, the more you'll get back from it. So if you're just out there on blast as a microphone, people will treat you like a microphone. But if you're out there to build relationships, then they'll start paying more attention to what you have to say when you have something to say. I'm going to quickly show just a few little examples of some favorite things that I have picked up over the past couple of years. The first is an example for LinkedIn. Don't forget, LinkedIn has the ability to post articles or blog posts. it's really great. People are, I think this is often overlooked, and I saw in the comments earlier that someone's using LinkedIn, so bravo to you. You're a trend starter, whoever you are. Oops, pardon me. Forgive me the terrible resolution for this photo, but this is one of our grad students, Priya. She wrote a long time ago on Medium, just expressing why she was marching for science. And this got picked up by the New York Times just because she was out there being bold about what she was thinking in the moment. It's another great way, a great example of matching expertise with timeliness. It's about a passion project. I mean, it's about her passion before it was about her research, but she was actually able to leverage that moment with the New York Times to talk about her research. So again, it's just making those connections about who you are as a person and what you believe in is also just as important about than just talking about just your research and the policy. And then this last example is from Frank Mitloehner. He is a great person to watch on Twitter. He is a master Twitter threader, I feel like now. And he will take a piece of other policy or another report or other science, and he will just break it down, whether he agrees with it or actually more controversial if he doesn't agree with it. And he will break it down, and he uses threaded tweets to do that. And it is so effective in getting his viewpoint across. And also you can tell people are living for that content online. It gets retweeted and engaged with quite frequently. So great person to watch for more examples. But the more you're listening and the more you're watching online, the more tips and things you're going to pick up, and you're going to establish your own style. So that's the quick and dirty for social media. We have some resources. Melissa and I spent a lot of the earlier part of this year building out the brand guideline. So we have all sorts of resources that are free, social media guides, best practices, platform best practices, op-ed best practices, how to get a hold of us. Hopefully this just whets your appetite. And if you want more, we have more. Obviously we can't pack this into half an hour. Were you going to say something, Melissa?
No.
Okay. The other thing that we'll say is at the very top part of this resource, the communications training for researchers, there is a small cost associated with this, but if you talk to your department chairs and your leads, we are going to be, it's like a 4-hour training, and we have had many grad students participate in this, much to our delight. Actually, we have amazing grad students here and doing really great research. So it doesn't matter if you're tenured faculty or not. This part of the communications training is open to you. There is a small cost that the department does, but it's very minimal. I think it's like $100 or something like that. So that should be something you can ask for. And then I don't know if we left any time for questions. Probably not. What do you think, Hannah?
Yeah, we think. So I think that we're right at time. And so I'm going to encourage everybody, if you have questions, to just feel free to email all of us, or, well, perhaps not all of us, email the person that you'd like to target with your question. But I do think I speak for all of us when I say that we love talking about this stuff, and we love making other people more effective communicators, because it makes life better for us when there's more better written stuff to read. And of course, we're all affiliated with UC Davis. And so the more we can get our people and our name out there, the better it is for everyone. Rising tide, all boats. So I think we'll close it out here. Like I noted in the Q&A, this presentation was recorded, and we'll distribute a recording of it to everybody who had RSVP'd for today's session. And then we'll also, I guess we can talk about it here. Melissa and Sally, are you guys okay with having your slides posted and distributed, or would you prefer not? Prefer not. Yeah? No?
I think it's
It's fine.
It's okay. And Austin, are you comfortable with that as well?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we'll go ahead. We'll perhaps not post them publicly, but we will distribute a copy of the slides to everybody who RSVP'd for today's call as well.
That would be great.
And just one other thing is talking about policy briefs. We at the Policy Institute are always really excited to work with people who have ideas for policy briefs. And so, like, for instance, we presented the RPS one that Ingrid contacted us and worked with us on. And so if that's something that you're interested in, you have to do a lot of the legwork for it, but we certainly are happy to provide guidance to help you get it over the finish line. So we encourage you to reach out to us on that as well. And I think we're right at time, so I'll thank my fellow panelists and thank everybody who's attended today and encourage you to continue the conversation offline.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Happy science communication. Ning.